Good morning. Happy Thursday. We're almost there, folks. We're almost to Friday. So, one of the James Freeman supporters, same kind of mindset, the anarchist mindset, I think is making a good faith attempt at arguments in my comments. So I'm going to respond to it. Essentially his thesis is that it's not moral to give one group of people rights and powers that other people don't get. And morality is a touchy subject. Different peoples, different cultures, different religious groups have different morals. And morals have changed over time. Like in the past, sacrificing babies to the gods, like literally killing them, either, throwing them in fires and things like that, however they did it, was moral. I would argue that we still have that today with abortion, but, we still have the baby sacrifices, not the morality. Now, you could argue that they're under your religious or cultural background that there is one true morality, and I would argue that, Christian morality is the true morality. But we are not a nation that is particularly beholding to any given religion. There are state-sanctioned religions that do get tax benefits, but we don't have a state religion. So arguing morality isn't going to get you very far. Really, the only arguments you can make are, does the state have the power to do it? And is it practical for the state to use that power for that purpose? You could really only argue the might to do it and the right to do it, I guess, technically. The state obviously has the might to do pretty much whatever it wants. So the right to do it, and is it practical to do? Is it something that is beneficial or otherwise? Those are really the only arguments you can make on it. Trying to impose your system of morality is going to be no more effective than trying to impose your interpretation of the Constitution. Like, great, that's yours. You're entitled to it. Free speech, free thought is something that we do have enshrined in the law. But ultimately, that's just your opinion, bro. And the state does have a monopoly on power. Like, the state does have it. And it rules through force. Now, could the people collectively gather enough force to overturn the state, either through enacting new laws or through just pure rebellion? Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's typically the way that massive changes, those are two of the ways that massive changes have been made to various state governances throughout time. Peacefully done in England, like through the Magna Carta and things like that, and more violently done in various uprisings throughout Europe, like the French Revolution. Very violent, overthrew the entire government. They didn't like it. They wanted a different one. The people did it. But the state does rule through force, and your rights, the state does give you rights. Like, you might want to believe that God gives you rights, but show me where God is enforcing your rights. If you think you have a God-given right to do X, and someone prevents you from doing it, does God smite them down? No, he doesn't. You go to a cop, you go to the court, you go to the government. The government is the one who gives you your rights. They give you your rights. I mean, you might not like that. You might disagree with the premise of it, but the government gives you your rights. because only the government can enforce your rights. I mean, maybe you're a big tough dude and you can push other people around, but then eventually the government's going to get involved and deal with you. So yes, it is a system based on force, and you might not like that, but that's the way it is. I mean, there's a reason. There's a reason we have three branches of governments. We have the executive branch, and their job is to enforce the laws. They use force. That's what they do. The government has a monopoly on force. So, morally, whatever, but like, first of all, that is what it is, and that has always been what it has always been. There is no state throughout time that has not relied on a monopoly of force to govern. And again, if the people collectively decide that they're done with it, they have means to remove the state's monopoly on force, take it back to themselves, and then they're going to enact a new government, which will then have the monopoly of force again. That is just the way humans work. We're a social animal. We always fall into a hierarchy where the person or persons on top have the monopoly of force. That is how it works. Because if you're going to get people together, people are going to have disagreements. Again, we're a social animal, but we're a fairly cantankerous social animal. And how do you deal with that? Well, you deal with that by creating laws and then enforcing those laws. And in order to enforce those laws, you need someone to judge whether or not a crime has been committed. But our government specifically has rules in place where they're not allowed to give one group of people different rights than other people. Equal protection under the law. But what the government can do is give persons legal protections in certain situations. For example, if you and I enter into a contract and then we get into a dispute over the contract and I say, I interpret the contract this way and you interpret the contract that way, if it was left to us, well, it would ultimately be resolved by whoever has more force or more willingness to apply force than the other side. You can't have a stable society doing that. You can't have free trade working without someone there, a ostensibly neutral third party, to interpret that contract, to say whether or not you violated someone's rights, to identify what rights you actually have, and then to enforce those rights through some sort of police or whatever. I know this is basic civics, but it doesn't seem like people understand this. State governance is necessary for a people. State governance is mandatory. It is inherent. It's baked in the system. Societies don't work if they don't have a government. You look at some of the, like, Mogadishu and stuff like that, where there's just warlords. Well, first of all, the warlords create a stable governing structure, mostly stable governing structure, a more stable governing structure. That is just the way people work. In anarchy, people rise up and assume authority. It's humanity. This is what we are. You might not like it. You might say it's immoral, but that's what it is. But it also makes sense. So I was saying the government gives legal protections to certain people, or to people generally, any person in certain situations. For example, no one has the right to kill anybody else except people in certain situations. If you reasonably believe that you or someone else, generally speaking, hashtag talk to a local attorney, if you reasonably believe that you or someone else is an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury by someone else, the state gives you a legal protection called self-defense or defense of others, to apply lethal force in that situation. It's in that situation. It's not like the government is handing out licenses to kill anybody, but in that situation, you get different legal protections. A doctor doesn't have blanket protections just because he's a doctor. He has protections in certain circumstances, legal protections in certain circumstances, i.e. in the practice of his trade, that give him protections against medical malpractice. Outside of that, if a doctor fixes your car, he doesn't have medical malpractice protections don't apply. Cops have qualified immunity in certain circumstances, i.e. when they are actively engaged in their role as a police officer or a sheriff or whatever, they have certain legal protections. Outside of that role, again, if a cop walks into an operating room and starts operating on you and screws up, he doesn't have the cop legal protections anymore because he's not acting as a cop. So the cop doesn't have those protections. In that circumstance, the person, whoever acting in that circumstance, has those legal protections. It's not additional rights. It's legal protections. Cops don't have more rights than you. They have more legal protections in their role as a cop than you do or anyone else does outside of the role of being a cop. If a cop deputizes you, all of a sudden you have those legal protections. Magically, in doing what you've just been deputized to do, you have those legal protections. It's not inherent to the cop as a human. It's inherent to whoever's doing the role, whoever's doing the actions, whoever is in that particular circumstance. A judge has absolute judicial immunity in his role as a judge, specifically in his role judging cases. Once he steps outside of that to like an administrative task, all of a sudden he loses those protections. When he walks out of the courtroom, if he rear ends you, he doesn't have those judge legal protections. It's not his protections, it's the protections of the person doing that job. Judge pro tems, they're not judges. A pro tem is just it's a lawyer in California. It has to be a lawyer who's just been given the role of acting as a judge for a day. While that lawyer is acting as a judge for the day in the role of being a judge, that lawyer has absolute judicial immunity. Litigation privilege. In California, I mean, your state might have some variations on this, but in California, anything that you say related to that legal matter while there is a pending legal matter, you have a privilege against suit. And you could raise that privilege as a defense if you get sued over it. You could say horribly slanderous things. In family law, people often do. And the other side will be offended. That's defamation. I want to sue them for defamation. Well, they have a recognized legal privilege in that circumstance where they could say anything slanderous they want to. In that circumstance, in that legal proceeding. If they said it outside of the legal proceeding, like if they just hopped on Facebook and said the same thing, the privilege goes away. It's not inherent to the person, it's inherent to the situation that person is in. Legislators' privilege. They could, while on the floor of the House or the Senate, they can say horribly slanderous things, and there is no cause of action against them for it. They have a privilege to say it in that role. They step outside of it, they go on a news channel, and they say the exact same thing. All of a sudden, it's something they can get sued over. It's the situation, not the person, that provides extra legal protections. And he had a really weird argument why it should be one person why it's somehow more immoral or wrong to give to one person or one group of people the right to tax, the right to enforce the laws, the right to this, the right to that. And I think he ignores a lot of second order consequences. Like, you can't have just Joe Blow, any Joe Blow, decide, you know what, today I'm going to go collect taxes. First of all, how do the people paying the taxes know that that person is actually collecting taxes and not just robbing them under the guise of collecting taxes? So you have to, in order for society to function, you have to have a recognized specific group of people who have the authority to collect taxes. California, it's the Franchise Tax Board. For the United States, it's the IRS. So you know when you're dealing with that person that you're actually paying your taxes and not just getting robbed. Well, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's and all that, but sometimes I feel like I'm still being robbed. So it doesn't make sense. And enforcing the laws, it doesn't make sense because if you have multiple groups enforcing the law, multiple persons, anybody on the street can enforce the law. It's not going to get enforced in the same way. And as we've already covered, your average Joe citizen doesn't have the training, the knowledge, the experience to understand the laws that they're trying to enforce. And cops have a fairly limited understanding. They don't have the same kind of understanding as an attorney would or a judge. But they have more than your average citizen. And like enforcing it, like if you don't have one group responsible for deciding, making a judgment, you run into issues. There's a Supreme Court case, Erie something or the other, I forget. I always call it Erie. But that's where the United States Supreme Court decided that there is no federal common law. Why did they have to decide that? Well, it's because people were trying to figure out, where am I going to get the best possible outcome? If I sue in the state, I'm not going to get as good of an outcome as if I sue in federal court. So there's two competing jurisdictions that were looking at the same facts and giving two different outcomes. And that's a problem because society needs certainty to function, relative certainty. You got to know, if I breach contract, this is what I'm looking at. And then you can make decisions based on that, because it's not a crime to breach a contract. You can make a business decision, but now you get uncertainty. If you can go in this court or this court or this court or this court or this court, and that harms society. People can't make effective decisions anymore. It creates chaos. It creates confusion, anarchy. So you need one group to do it. And that's why federal courts on state issues use the state's law. That's why states have provisions in their laws about choice of law. So you can kind of determine, like, if I make a contract with this guy in Florida, his state law might apply or my state law might apply. And so I can make a determination based on the choice of laws. So if he sues me, I know what laws are going to apply because I look at the Florida choice of law statutes. If I sue him, I'm going to know what law is going to apply because I can look at California choice of laws. If I sue in federal court, well, if he sues me, they're going to have to use Florida's choice of law. If I sue him, they're going to have to use California's choice of law. If I sue him in Florida, I know that they're, even in federal court in Florida, I know. So you have certainty. You can make decisions. Enforcing judgments. Once you get the judgment, if anybody could do it, think about you get a judgment, $100, right? If you marched into the bank with that, you're putting the bank, if you could march into the bank and say, here's my judgment, pay me out of his bank account. You're putting the bank in a position where they don't know. They don't know. Like, I mean, is it a real judgment? I don't know. You're putting the bank in a bad position. So the bank is going to potentially incur liability for just paying you out. So at least in California, the sheriff executes bank levies. That gives the bank certainty, because we know who you are. We know you're authorized to do this. And we have protections from liability because we have surrendered it to the sheriff. And the sheriff requires certain protections, statutory in California. You have to give them all the paperwork that shows that this is a valid judgment, and so they could verify it and everything like that. But there's a reason for all those things. It's to keep order. Order is necessary for a society to function. The less order you have in a society, the more chaos there is, the more problems there are. That is just an inherent fact. Societal breakdown is where order is removed, where people have less certainty. One of the second order effects of cops like Chauvin getting put in prison for applying techniques that were policy of that particular, and they were policy because it reduced risk. Doesn't mean they were perfect, but it was policy, and things become policy because they reduce risk, they reduce liability. But now all of a sudden, that technique is now considered murder. So now that department has to use a more risky restraint technique, one that they've probably already looked at, to determine how are we going to reduce our risk? How are we going to reduce our liability? Cops are also going to be concerned about liability. If you want cops, you can't expose them to unlimited liability, because cops are human. Cops have to make split-second decisions. And if they could just get their pantsuit off every time they make an arrest, or in Chile de Castro's case, every time they even write an affidavit, you're not going to have people willing to be cops anymore. Or you have to reduce their liability by, having the government supply them with defense, having the government indemnify them for their actions. One way or the other, you're going to end up paying for it. Either you pay for it by giving them increased protections, or you pay for it by paying increased taxes, because they're going to want to get paid more, or they're going to want to be indemnified or whatever, in order to incentivize them to do this job. And that's why we give doctors protections, because it's inherently risky. It's inherently risky to cut on a human being, even for their benefit. There's an inherent risk involved. And if we took away the protections for doctors, why would you be a doctor? Sure, I can make a bunch of money, but I could also spend a bunch of money fighting lawsuits and paying out awards for things that were an inherent risk. So you have to reduce their liability to have these positions, these necessary things. Cops are necessary. They don't have more rights just because they're cops. They have more duties, and so they have to be able to effectuate those duties. And so they're given legal protections to effectuate those duties. Anyway, none of the anarchy stuff makes sense. Anarchy is libertarianism on steroids, and it doesn't make sense. Libertarianism is stupid. You've got to have a government. That's just the way humans function, because humans have disagreements. Just like you have a different interpretation of the Constitution than the Supreme Court does, well, you're going to have a different interpretation of a contract. You're going to have a different interpretation of what it means to stop at a stop sign. Well, I stopped. Well, but did you really? The cop has a different interpretation than you. Well, who's going to resolve that? Gunfight between you and the cop? That's probably not going to do society a lot of good. No, the court will decide. Anyway, that's all I got for you today. Thanks for watching. Again, I don't always agree with the government, but that's just my opinion, bro. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.